Hi, this is Gina Wagers, and we're going to be discussing People First language. First of all, the goals of our People First language training include being able to define People First language, what it is and what it is not. That includes giving examples and non-examples of what that language sounds like, understanding the impact on school culture and climate that this type of language has, and then also being able to promote appropriate use of language among students and staff within our buildings. So to start with, why is People First language important? Our language shapes our attitudes, the things that we believe and the things that we feel, and those are the ways that we speak to people. And then those attitudes and language drive our actions. So if we want all of those things to align, it's important not just to think about the beliefs that we hold and the way that we speak to people, but the way that we treat them too, and what that says about our values and what we want to represent in our buildings. People First language is used to communicate appropriately and respectfully with and about individuals with disabilities. People First language is exactly what it sounds like. When you're using People First language, you're emphasizing the person first, not their disability. So some examples of what that might sound like: phrases like a person who, a person with, or a person who has. This can include statements like a student with, a student who has, and etc. Instead of saying things like the disabled or handicapped student, we want to say the student with a disability. Instead of saying the special education student, we want to say the student with special education services. Instead of saying things like disturbed or insane, we want to say person first, a person with an emotional disability, or a person who has a mental health impairment. So again, just emphasizing the person is first. We're not labeling people based on a diagnosis that they might have. Other tips for using People First language, again, we just want to emphasize their abilities. We don't want to start a statement by with a limitation, something that someone cannot do or something that someone has been labeled with, because those are generally negative. We also don't want to use offensive language or negative stereotypes. We don't want to portray people with disabilities as inspirational only because of their disability either. A lot of times I'll hear this when I hear staff members talking about students who do have disabilities. We might catch ourselves saying things like, oh, even though they have the disability, this student does surprisingly well at this task or with this particular content area. So instead of making statements like that, we can just emphasize that the student is making progress and making gains and doing things well, regardless of what their medical diagnosis might be. Other tips for People First language: not all disabilities are obvious or visible, so you should never assume, and you should always be aware. People First language also applies to our physical spaces within our buildings as well, not just when we're talking about people, but when we're talking about spaces that accommodate for people who might have disabilities. These can be restrooms, classrooms. None of these should be referred to or named by who they're serving. So for example, instead of saying the disabled restroom, it's a restroom with accessible toilets. Instead of saying parking for disabled people, it's an accessible parking space. Instead of saying, oh, the SPED classroom or the SPED teacher, we can reframe that and we can say the classroom that has supports for students who receive special education services, or the teacher who works with special education students, right? But again, we're putting people first, and we're not labeling spaces based on the limitations that they have for people who are using them. The impact that this kind of language has on our schools: when we use People First language and we put people first instead of labeling them based on disabilities, it helps us to build positive peer relationships, not just between staff members as we're talking and holding each other accountable for putting students and their needs first instead of their disability first, but it also helps students as well to interact with their peers more appropriately. This creates support and an inclusive environment, not just within each classroom, but then within the school as well. It also promotes positive culture and climate, which can be felt all around the building as people are interacting more appropriately and more kindly with one another. So how do we support staff in using People First language? Again, sharing a student's disability and descriptors is only appropriate when you're in a specific service meeting and you're talking about the student's specific needs. For example, this might be an IEP meeting or a SIT, student improvement team meeting. But again, you should never be discussing openly a diagnosis or label that a student has unless it's specifically relevant to a plan that you're making to provide service. And again, you should always Consider too the environment in which you're speaking about a student, because you do not want other students to overhear. You don't want to be sharing information that shouldn't be shared with other staff in the building as well. So just be cognizant of who's around and what information you're sharing and how you're speaking about people. Regardless of whether it's an IEP, a 504, a behavior plan, or any other kind of specific health plan, ultimately, the thing to remember is that it is our job to change the environment and to provide the supports and accommodations that are going to ensure that student's success, regardless of whatever label or diagnosis they might have. Just like it's important for us to consider how we speak to one another as adults in the building and how we're carrying ourselves to create that environment, we also want to be teaching students how to do this as well. Insults and slurs that students use, they might not really understand the full impact of their words and how they're shaping how people feel in the environment around them. So it's also our role to provide that support and direct teaching to students. Not only does it emotionally impact the people that are being targeted when students throw these mean sayings around to one another, but it also impacts the safety of the environment in which all of the other students are existing as well, because they're overhearing these things, and then that creates a culture and climate within that classroom or building that that's how those students perceive that this is what's acceptable, and we don't want that to be the case. So whenever you're dealing with students, immediately address and correct any behavior, and then teach appropriate replacement language. So a lot of times students will just throw things out like, oh, you're sped. But again, teaching replacement language, we can teach them to say things like, oh, well, if that's how you feel, maybe make a statement about how you feel. Well, I feel frustrated that you don't understand this. But again, we're not labeling people or insulting them based on their abilities. Again, another one that I hear a lot is when students want to use the word like retard, explaining to them what that word actually means and the negative connotation that it has so that they understand why they shouldn't use that is important, and then teaching them a replacement instead. Again, instead of insulting someone or making fun of them or making them feel bad for something that they can't do, frame these in a positive way. Pick something that they can do well or that you appreciate that they did, and refrain from giving them those critiques that make people group people or label people based on negatives. Same thing with statements like lame. A lot of times kids say things are lame, but instead of that, maybe teaching them other words that they can use, synonyms, maybe things that express what they're feeling so that they're not using words that have those negative connotations. So in conclusion, again, all students are unique individuals with unlimited potential. It's our job to help create environments that are safe for them and to make those accommodations to where they can be successful regardless of what labels or diagnosis they have. So we always need to make sure that we're using language that places the student and their abilities first. And then I do have references.